a conversation between us.
Speak out. We have a duty to all children and to their futures. Soldiers speak out.
Welcome to the Veterans Hour, a monthly program produced by the Rachel Corrie Chapter 109, Veterans for Peace in Olympia, Washington. I'm Mark Fleming, your host for this month's program. Veterans for Peace is a global organization of military veterans and civilian associates whose collective efforts build a culture of peace by using our experiences and lifting our voices. We inform the public of the true causes of war and the enormous costs of war with an obligation to heal the wounds of war. The Rachel Corrie Chapter in Olympia is one of over 140 chapters worldwide whose work includes educating the public, advocating an end to the militarism and the war economy, providing services that assist veterans and other victims of war, and most significantly, working to end all war. Each month, we present a program focusing on veterans and issues of war and peace. This month's program discusses the Ken Burns-Lynn Novick documentary, The Vietnam War, which is broadcast on PBS stations in late September. I'm very pleased to have my guests for this program, two activist veterans, David Dittemore from Chapter 134 in Tacoma, and Larry Kirshner from Chapter 109 in Olympia. So welcome, gentlemen. And to start off, please, Larry, why don't you tell us about your Vietnam or your veterans experience?
I did my basic training at Fort Lewis, went to Fort Polk for advanced infantry training, went to Fort Knox and learned how to drive an armored personnel carrier. I went to Vietnam on Thanksgiving of '67. I was attached to the 4th Infantry Division in the Central Highlands, and I was there until January 8th of 1969.
And you were serving in combat as an infantryman?
Yeah, I was infantry. I was in the bush for the whole of the 14 months I was there, except for 6 or 7 days.
Mm-hmm. And David?
Yeah, I was a naval reservist, so I drilled my last year of high school and all 4 years of college, and then went in as a storekeeper, an E4, and made E5 a few months later in a supply depot in Da Nang, Vietnam. It's interesting, Larry mentioned Thanksgiving. My experience was going to Travis Air Force Base. I think it was the morning of Thanksgiving Day, and looking forward. In fact, we've mentioned the Burns documentary several times that Thanksgiving Day was the one day you got a big meal in the service. Looking for that meal when I got there, and because the international dateline, I arrived the day after Thanksgiving and said, this is going to be my whole military experience. But anyway, so I was a clerk in the supply depot there, and an office thing in supply depot in Da Nang. Luckily, didn't see any combat, although I told friends that there'd be a bullet over the barracks once or twice a month. I did my best impression of a pancake. But so my second year, I was on a destroyer escort, USS O'Callahan. In fact, before we started mentioning the Turner Joy, that was a ship that we steamed with. We'll call the Westpac cruises. And so part of my time was off the coast of Vietnam. We called plane guard duty, following the aircraft carriers, picking up things that fell off aircraft carriers like planes and people.
Okay. And I also served in Vietnam. I was an infantryman with the 1st Cavalry for 5 months in the bush, and then they made me company clerk, and after that I was a combat typist, I guess you'd call it. But it was enough to tell me what it was like and get a feel. And I was in there at the end of the war. I was among the people that John Kerry asked about, the last men to die for a mistake, because that's who we were and that's when we served. So with that, we have 3 Vietnam veterans here today to talk about this documentary, The Vietnam War. It was produced by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, and as many of you may be familiar, Ken Burns makes very detailed, extensive documentaries about public issues, and this was a 10-part, 18-hour broadcast in late September, covered the war pretty much from covered Vietnam history and the war from, I think, about 1860 up to 1975, but most of it's about America. And because it's a Ken Burns movie, it's likely to be considered to be one of the definitive discussions of the war. So one of the things that we wanted to do is talk about it as veterans. We also have, as Veterans for Peace, we're involved with something called the Vietnam Full Disclosure Project. And Larry, would you like to talk about that or tell a little bit about that?
Well, the Pentagon decided to commemorate the Vietnam War, the 50th anniversary, what they figured the 50th anniversary, with a, I don't remember, 13 or 15 year program that they basically said they wanted to set the story straight about Vietnam, and they wanted to honor the veterans, saying that we Vietnam veterans were not honored before, so the Pentagon wants to honor us now. My personal interpretation of what they're talking about is by honoring the veteran, they are setting the public up to think so highly of veterans, their honor and their glory, that when the next war comes along, the American public is more likely to support it because they want to honor the veterans. So that's the Vietnam Full Disclosure Project of Veterans for Peace was started in response to that, because we thought there needed to be a counter message to what the Pentagon was saying. As if you search the Pentagon's, the site that they have, there's so many things that are left out, some of which were left out of the Burns film too, but much more is left out of the Pentagon's.
Right. In fact, the VFP has published several copies of the magazine Full Disclosure, and most recently it's been updated to address some of the issues in the Burns-Novick documentary. David, and you, David, you passed these out at the State Fair most recently. What kind of reaction did you get?
A lot of people looked at them. Of course, there wouldn't be time to read them, but yeah, there is interest, and I talked to several people that were very interested in watching the documentary. A lot of that was before it actually started, but we hope it's a big opportunity for our organization to go out and talk to general people about these issues. It seemed to me, the more I watched, that it's really just a documentary about war, and it talked about the Vietnam War in particular, but I think that's one thing we're trying to fight. A lot of people think, well, that's just an aberration, because we're America and we're predestined by God, and we're going to win everything. Was that somebody saying we're going to make America great again, and we're
Something like that.
get so sick and tired of winning? But the fact that there was atrocities, there's been atrocities in all wars. Innocent civilians being killed, war crimes. I think that's one of our missions in Veterans for Peace, is talk about these things. And we just think this is an opportunity for Veterans for Peace to go out to civic groups, faith communities, because they're always looking for speakers. Let's talk about that, or panel discussions, kind of like we're doing right now, to talk about these things.
And one thing that Ken Burns said when he was introducing this over the past year is he's looking for discussion, and he talked about healing. Somehow this will allow us to come to terms and maybe put Vietnam behind us. Wasn't entirely clear. He also said he's not offering any answers, which means it's incumbent on us to look at the information he presents and come to our own answers. So one of the things we want to do here tonight is to present some additional information that wasn't in the movie, give an overview of how it addressed some of those issues. I guess to start off, Dave, what was your overall impression? You watched all 10 episodes?
Yes, it was interesting to me, and of course I give the greatest respect to Larry and you of being in combat. Like I said, only 20% were in combat. The rest, we're people like me sending the bullets up and all this stuff in support. But to see the battle scenes, and the thing is, I always try to tie things together, but like this thing in Las Vegas a week or so ago, of seeing 500 people slaughtered by one guy with an automatic gun. I mean, that's what combat is like, seeing 50 people blown away and 500 injured by one guy. And because I think I always had the concept of not knowing that much about combat, that okay, we'd have one or two guys killed this day and one or two guys killed here, that we'd lose hundreds of people in one battle. And that warfare, it's a cat and mouse game that it's obvious you want to have, huge numbers against your opponent. Well, the opponent is thinking, no, that's what I want. And so it's always tricking. And they're thinking, there's one thing about going up the hill, and they capture this one guy, and he said, well, there's 1,000 guys on the top of the hill. So they storm up there and discover there's 5,000 guys on the top of the hill, and we get our tushes wiped. But that's all this stuff that's back and forth, and us poor guys and women too are getting killed. And to me, that was the valuable thing in this documentary, because they took the time to interview Vietnamese soldiers, because I'd read about the war before, but hadn't heard that point of view before. And to me, it was so revealing to hear their side of the story.
Yeah. Larry, how about you? What about overall impressions?
Burns and Novick are masterful film storytellers. I think that the story that they told was done cinematically, pretty interestingly. The background music that they played brought back feelings of brotherhood and how it was during the 60s. So there's some psychological impact from the way they did it. Like I said earlier, there's a number of things they left out, but I think the largest thing that they left out was the historical context of what was going on. Like you said, they spoke a little bit about the Vietnamese history, but unless you understood the historical context, there's no way to judge the rest of what they said. And most Americans don't realize that August 22nd, 1945, Truman and de Gaulle met, and de Gaulle said that unless the Americans helped France recover their colonies, he might be forced to make an alliance with the Soviets who were moving into Eastern Europe. So Truman made this deal to support the French troops. Our ships took the French troops back to Vietnam. We gave them money, I think it was $23 million the first year, to support the French taking Vietnam back again. And that's when we should say that the Vietnam War started, was in 1945. We shouldn't say that it started in 1965. So there's those 20 years of us supporting the colonialism of the French as part of our imperialism and becoming the power in the world. So unless you know that context and knowing that there was no such thing as a Republic of South Korea or South Vietnam before we created it. Same thing in Korea too. But we fabricated this thing out of whole cloth. There was supposed to have been an election with the South and the North deciding who was going to run the country as a whole. And Eisenhower refused to have that election. It had been decided in Geneva to do that. So that was another instance where we stepped in and we prevented the people there from their own history.
And one impression I had was all these things were there in this movie, but it was hard, especially they were presented in the first few episodes, and then once the movie got rolling, you never really saw that. You really had to think about that. You said that there's a context there, and it was presented, but it wasn't obvious or reiterated throughout the movie. And of course, Ken Burns says there is no one truth, so he did not want to present that.
But he started off, because he didn't put the context there, his statement in the first couple of minutes of the first episode was that the war was conducted by, in good faith by decent people who made some mistakes.
Right.
And unless you knew that this was part of the colonial imperialist push of the United States and France, and you look at that statement, you know that statement's not true. And if that statement's not true, what about the rest of the film isn't true?
Now, some of the things that were true, I mean, David mentioned this about the intensity of the combat. I saw that on the news at the time, but I never really saw as much as I saw in the film. I mean, just how people just standing up, firing an M60 machine gun over their head, just scrambling. I watch it, and also seeing the Vietnamese come out of their tunnels and just swarming the Americans, and the scope of the battles. I mean, I always thought about firefights. I mean, when I was there, we just had ambushes. We'd have, I think the most we ever had killed at one time was 5 people. So they weren't large scale. What we saw in this film, this was large scale. The other thing they presented, and I'm not sure what their intent was, but it certainly made an impression on me, was I guess the apocalyptic scope of our war against the Vietnamese. How much ordnance we dropped, how much artillery we fired, how we just wasted the country. So I saw that, and all that's in the movie.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's a little, I guess, subtle. That's like we can't just dismiss it, because he covers all the bases. He even has the Vietnamese voices. So everything is there. But again, I guess the proportion, the way it's presented, that's where you really have to look.
Right. I think they actually had Colonel Edward Lansdale in one of the first couple of episodes. I don't remember. I think he was in there. But he's the one who's quoted as saying, "There's only one means of defeating an insurgent people who will not surrender, and that's extermination." And that concept of total war, which you could put Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that, but beyond that, what we did in Korea, where we killed 2 million Koreans in North Korea, we did things like, well, at the end of the Second World War at Nuremberg, there were about 30 Nazis who were hung for one thing or another. One of the Nazis that was hung was the guy who was in charge of the German army in Holland. And the reason he was hung was because he put holes in the dikes, and all of the farmland was flooded.
Wow.
So not more than 3 years later, the US Army was destroying the Toxin Dam in North Korea right after spring planting, to destroy all that farmland and kill thousands of people. So that's the kind of total war, and Vietnam was just an extension of that idea.
Now, apparently, we never bombed the dikes in Vietnam, but we bombed everything else.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, we bombed Cambodia, and a good estimate there is 750,000 Cambodians were killed by our bombing between '69 and '75.
and then you mentioned that that Burns and Novick are excellent storytellers. I mean, I guess one that I found the whole thing engaging. I was kind of, I think, like watching a train wreck. You can't take your eyes off it. And I didn't really want to watch it to begin with, but out of a sense of duty, I did, and I did find it. It's almost like, I don't want to say war porn, but there was a lot of war going on, and just seeing how it was conducted, and seeing how determined both sides were. I mean, it made me feel a little bit, see the Americans as more, I guess, dedicated at first. By the time I got there, nobody was dedicated. We did search and avoid type missions.
Well, it occurs to me too that this was back in the '60s, that we were all brought up talking about World War II, and the concept of war was one country versus another country. Of course, in those days it was always France and Germany going at each other, and Britain over this, that, and the other. And I think it talked in the documentary about we're always refighting the last war. Well, so us young bucks, I think said the average age was 19 as compared to 26 in World War II. We're in there, we're going to go win this war, and so we're going to kill these people, and all we know is we've got to kill Vietnamese, but we're there to help the Vietnamese. And I think once people got in country, I think this little mind meld started going on about what in the heck are we doing?
And how do I know that Vietnamese is the right kind of Vietnamese?
And because we had to have body count, we're killing innocent civilians and counting them as enemy. Sometimes we're starting the great habit of carrying a spare AK-47 with them, putting them, which now our troops have learned that, and Afghanistan and Iraq, and we even hear the police doing that, you carry a spare gun with your DNA on it and plan on somebody to justify killing somebody. But yeah, that's the nature of war.
We came up with a concept of free fire zones. And basically that meant at night we had large areas where we would kill anything that moved in that area. And we had no way of knowing if the villagers or anyone out there knew that we were doing this or not. And again, it's estimated that 50,000 Vietnamese were killed in free fire zones. That's another war crime. Speaking of war crimes, I didn't hear any mention of the Nuremberg principles or any international law discussed during the 18 hours.
And I think that's probably the real root of it. I mean, what was the nature of this war? Was it legal? Was there any reason for us to be there? Did we have any moral or legal authority? Now, we said we were defending the Republic of South Vietnam, but as you mentioned, where did that come from? Vietnam was never two countries.
Right.
In fact, Ho Chi Minh commented in his Declaration of Independence that one of the things that France had done was they divided Vietnam into 5 territories to break up their unity. So any division they did not recognize, and they never did.
Well, and the big thing in those days was the dominoes, the domino theory, because we'd lost China to Chairman Mao, and the big fear was communism was going to come down there, go to Australia, then next California, and this was a place we could stop it. Let me see, what do we say? We're fight them there instead of fighting them here. And,
See, that sounds very contemporary.
But so we had all these great ideas, and I think a lot of volunteers to start with about this is a noble thing, but that was the thing that uncovered as the documentary went on, that our leaders were lying to us, that they were like bombing these other countries and never admitting it, increasing the troops and never talking about it. And then, of course, the other complicating factor was the draft. Later in the war, the late 60s, that there were people, men and women, that didn't really want to be there, didn't know what the heck they were fighting for, found out that their lieutenant was the one that was going to send them out to get killed. So, the only logical thing is to kill the lieutenant. Yeah, we just...
And it was also easy in a combat zone.
Nobody
ever counted grenades.
Everybody had a gun. In fact, I had an opportunity to get out of the field one time because of a medical issue that I was having, and I much preferred to be out in the field where I had a gun and could protect myself than to be in base camp where I didn't feel like I could protect myself. So what you were just saying triggered something I had read in terms of the domino theory, and that was the propaganda that was being said. But the leaders, they knew that different. This is what Secretary of State John Foster Dulles said on March 2nd, 1954, quote, "It is rich in many raw materials such as tin, oil, rubber, and iron ore. The area has great strategic value. It has major naval and air bases." He was talking about Vietnam in 1954. And that's one of the reasons why we were using the French as a proxy there.
Well, and we became a world power in World War II. In World War I to some extent, but World War II we were not damaged, and we were the arsenal of democracy. Boeing started building B-17s and B-29s, and Ford was churning out Jeeps and this, that, and the other, and tanks. And so we were this prosperous economy, and then the GIs came back home, and they had some money in their pockets, and they'd been through depression, then this war, and they wanted to start buying cars, buying houses, or whatever.
Right.
So this McNamara guy worked for Ford Motor Company, and Ford was doing pretty darn good because they were selling Fords left and right. And so Johnson, they called the whiz kids or whatever, these cabinet people, that, gosh, he must be super duper because he figured out how to make Ford, make a lot of Fords, make a lot of money. So they put him in charge of the Department of Defense, and they were talking about these, 9,000-page reports they came up with every month. It was just so much that was unintelligible.
Systems analysis.
He thought if we can put numbers on everything and count the bullets and the body count, we have to win. But it's interesting to follow that his disillusionment after a few years.
Yeah.
Of course, he would never come out in public. I think he wrote a book,
20 years later.
20, yeah, I mean, just the last 20 years or so in our recollection. But, and even I saw a good documentary about Johnson, his phone conversations they taped, he was calling people, what can I do? Because he knew that there was no way, but the Pentagon kept saying more, more, more. And to make it look like he was trying to do something, he gave the Pentagon pretty much what they wanted in most cases. But
It wasn't just the Pentagon saying more, more, more. It was the arms merchants who were saying
Oh.
more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of the Second World War, they convinced the powers, meaning the arms merchants, convinced the powers to be that the reason we got out of the Depression was all the spending for
Yeah.
the war. So we needed to continue that spending
Yeah.
cycle, and that's where the military
And of course, there was a
industrial
threat.
complex,
The
and
con-
that's what Eisenhower warned against as he was leaving the stage. And so today we have 435 congressional districts, and every single congressional district has a piece of the defense budget
Yeah.
in their area. So nobody's going to talk against the defense
Exactly.
department
Yeah.
because it means jobs.
Now, actually, you mentioned earlier, I think both of you talked about the lies, and I think that was one thing I thought was pretty well presented in the movie, the tapes. Just
Yeah.
seeing that big tape recorder and that reel running, and Lyndon Johnson saying, "It's the damnedest thing. I don't know what to do," and then turning around showing him saying, "We will stand and fight, and we will, we're doing well." Just seeing those juxtapositions.
Exactly.
I mean,
Every one of them, it showed them lying
Yeah.
to the public when they knew the truth.
And
In fact, Johnson knew that Nixon had committed treason,
Yeah.
and he thought it would upset the public, so he didn't make it public.
yeah, and I think he was afraid of revealing the wiretaps.
Yeah,
So
well, that
for that,
too.
all that calculation, they didn't bring it out, and that would have made a big difference.
Huge
And
difference.
the 1968 election was the first election. Well, I turned 21, but not in time to vote.
Right.
But I was looking at it. Well, how would I vote on this? Hubert Humphrey didn't have any credibility. Richard Nixon he had a secret plan, and he wasn't Johnson. I could have almost voted for him, and that's kind of scary. And the secret plan apparently was to send me.
And the thing that occurred to me in the early episodes was things that I never knew before. And the one thing I'd mentioned is CIA working with Ho Chi Minh to help drive out the Japanese in World War II, because they'd occupied Vietnam, as everybody wants to occupy Vietnam. But our CIA, a lot of people realize, but that's like our secret army. And in fact, when we were getting ready to go into Afghanistan, the CIA was there first. Or am I thinking? No, I think Afghanistan. And they were really doing fairly well before then the Army went in and botched things up pretty well. But to give them some credit, the CIA actually knew the language and knew the society and the traditions and about the people and were
And
part
actually,
of society.
didn't one of their officers stand with Ho Chi Minh when he read his
Right.
Declaration of Independence?
Yeah.
That officer was planning to come back to stop the U.S. from doing something, and the Viet Cong shot him.
Oh, yeah. One of the first casualties.
not knowing who he was,
Yeah.
because he was in favor of them. So
And that's a history I've known since I came back from Vietnam because I've read about it, but I don't think most Americans really do know.
no.
Yeah.
And Ho Chi Minh quoted extensively from our Declaration of Independence.
Right.
He wrote Harry Truman and asked for support. And the one thing I did learn that I had not known before was Harry Truman never got that letter.
Right.
Yeah.
It was,
He also went to Wilson at Versailles after
Yeah.
the end of the First World War, asking, because Wilson talked about colonial peoples should be able to have democracies and they should be able to be free. And Ho Chi Minh, and they presented a declaration which Wilson may or may not have ever gotten. But what Wilson really meant was the colonies of the people who lost the First World War, those people could get freedom and democracy. The colonies of the people who won the war, there was going to be no change.
Right.
So the
Yeah, and
French.
one of my favorite authors is David McCullum, a famous historian. And one of his points is always, history is not inevitable. But think about that period that Ho Chi Minh they say, more of a nationalist than a communist. And I forget the other guy's name was working with it, was pro-communist more than nationalist.
Schwann.
Le Schwann, yeah.
Yeah, Schwann, that if the United States had worked with Ho Chi Minh and allowed the election, maybe it would have been a free country, maybe it would have been one of our great allies, but it's just that,
Or maybe it would have been another Yugoslavia. We worked with Tito.
yeah,
And maybe it would have been another Soviet bloc terrible place, but nobody gave us the right to decide the future
Yeah.
of the people
There
of
would
South
3 million,
Vietnam.
be 3 million less dead, and the country would not be poisoned.
Right.
They would not be having Agent Orange into
Right.
the third and fourth generations.
Yeah, when I was there a few years ago, there were little babies being born without arms and legs,
Yeah.
and they were fourth generation of Agent Orange.
yeah.
It's still going on. There's ordnance still killing people,
Mm-hmm.
unexploded ordnance still killing people every week in Vietnam. Nixon, as part of his agreement, promised I don't know how many $billion to rebuild Vietnam. To this day, we haven't sent them any money.
And also, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that they address, sort of, is the anti-war movement. But it doesn't come off very positively. Would you like to speak to that, with your observations?
Well, I just happened to watch the last episode today, and that was episode 10, and they only talked to a couple of anti-war people to start with, and in the middle, toward the end of the episode 10, one of the two that they talked to, she started apologizing for, well, she
Being
didn't
anti-war.
apologize for protesting. She apologized for calling soldiers baby killers. She was talking about the
And
best.
it wasn't clear if she'd actually
wasn't
done it or
clear.
if she just heard about
It
it.
wasn't clear, whether she did it or she was apologizing for people who may or may not have done it. But the other one who was somewhat against the war was the older sister of Mogi Crocker,
Right.
who was a young man who ended up being killed, and his sister became anti-war. But they had a guy named Todd, I don't remember his last name.
John Todd, the
Oh, the Canadian.
Who went to Canada. They had no discussion or interview with any soldiers who were drafted and then refused to go. They didn't have any of that. The only discussion they had about GI resistance was a little bit in the talk about racism that was going on, but there was very little. They had no discussion about the American Servicemen's Union. Andy Stapp started in 1967. They had 10,000 members who were active duty GIs who wanted minimum pay. They wanted to elect their officers, and they had a paper called The Bond, which went to all across the world. There was no discussion of anything like that. There were coffee houses outside of all of the bases that were staffed by active duty GIs. There was no discussion about that. There was a strong Catholic radical priests,
the Berrigans,
the Berrigan brothers in particular, and people like them who,
including our own Bernie Myers.
local Bernie Myers, who burnt draft records, who broke into Monsanto and did all that kind of stuff. There was no discussion at all or interview with any of those people. So that was the whole resistance that occurred among the people and the military. There was no discussion.
And it was also
about that.
discounted. Like whenever you saw the civilian anti-war, they came up pictures of the Summer of Love, of Woodstock. These were privileged white Americans
Right.
who were just having a good time compared to these, the GIs over there fighting for their lives. And there was this very stark contrast.
Right. Yeah.
And it tended to make it, well, why would you believe these, worthless people compared to these honorable soldiers who are risking their lives?
Yeah, exactly.
The one thing that occurred to me, though, is that they followed some people throughout the whole documentary. And this one guy, Musgrave, I think his name was very
The
interesting
Marine.
to me. I think his dad had been a soldier in World War II, if I'm correct. But he volunteered as a Marine early. I think he was over there in '64 or so. got
Actually, I think he was there during Tet in Hue in '68.
well, anyway, he got shot up pretty bad.
Yeah.
In fact, they said, should we take him in? I'll take him in. I think they triage 3 times, and they're about ready to throw him in the garbage bin. And one guy said, "Well, let's settle this guy in." They saved him.
Somehow.
Which one good thing that our medicine was wonderful in that war. We saved a lot of guys that probably would have died in World War II. But anyway, then he was in hospital for a long time because he was very seriously wounded. But then he wanted to go back again. But he was so seriously injured that they refused him. So he ended up going to college, which was ironic to me in my home state of Kansas. And he became anti-war. And to me, it's kind of interesting to follow the transition. And because then he became a member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and was there when Kerry gave his testimony before Congress. So it was interesting to see that transition. And one other thing I'd mention, I forget if it's one of the last episodes, there was one of the marches, there was a huge banner that said Veterans for Peace. And we have to make it clear, that was not our organization. Right. That's a perfectly logical thing to say, but our organization was not formed until the 80s, in the height of the Cold War. It was interesting, but to see that banner was fun.
But actually, on the back of one envelope I sent to my girlfriend, I had another veteran for peace. I mean,
yeah,
that's where the genesis of the idea came from. And seeing the Vietnam Veterans Against the War imagery on the film was as electrifying now as it was 40 years ago when I saw it or read about it in Stars and Stripes.
Well, and especially them throwing their medals back over the barricades into the Capitol building. I remember that. Yeah, it was just such a powerful statement. And the thing is, they had so much to say, or what we call our recognition of that we've been there, done that, is one reason our organization has so much power.
And I think that's, the public was turning against the war well before the Vietnam veterans, but that was one of the things I think that really tipped the balance. Yeah. Because at that point you saw how even the people that are fighting it don't understand this war. They think they're resisting it. Why continue? And of course, the one thing giving Richard Nixon some credit is, he knew he had to end the war somehow. Yeah. It's just he chose to do it in the worst way, or at least in a very bad way. But he was forced to do that by the citizens who stood up and said no more.
Yeah, it's been my opinion that there were 3 factors that ended the war. One was that the Vietnamese were incredible fighters. They were protecting their own land and their own homes. 2, the movement in the street here. The people, it got more and more people in the street here, and the political pressure that developed. And the 3rd factor was the resistance among the GIs. And resistance took a lot of avenues. There was fragging, like you mentioned earlier. There's been at least 500 incidents of fragging. There were work slowdowns. There were mutinies. There were riots in LBJ, Long Binh Jail, and in Da Nang. There were riots in those jails, to the point where there was a guy, Colonel Heinel, I think was his name, who wrote in 71 or 72. He wrote a document that basically said the morale in the U.S. military was so low that they couldn't trust the service people to do what they were told. Yeah. And so it was those 3 things that came together historically as what actually finally caused it to stop.
Yeah, Vietnam basically destroyed the U.S. Army.
Right.
Well, and the thing to me that in the conversation between Nixon and Kissinger especially, that Nixon's only concern was his reelection. And time the end of the war, just the right month or whatever, so he'd get reelection. I don't think he was concerned about innocent civilians being killed, Vietnamese soldiers being killed. I don't think he cared about our soldiers being killed. It was only his reelection.
Can't be too early, and there's got to be a decent interval before South Vietnam collapses. So
yeah, we couldn't have a collapse before the election. But it's so cynical. All of our politicians to this day, no one will vote a tax increase, which we really need for schools and this, that, and the other, or to tax the rich people, and everything. It's just everything is so cynical.
Yeah, I think that's where one of the reasons why pointing out that protest does work. It forced their hand. They had to do something. Of course, their cynicism kept them from doing it honestly and doing it directly, but it did. The war did finally end.
Yeah.
And it finally ended when the Vietnamese won, and it wasn't going to end until then. I think that was something. Anyone who had studied the history of Vietnam, and even in the early episodes, how many advisors did you see quotas say, "This is not going to work.
Exactly.
There's really no reason for us to be here."
It wasn't a secret.
Yeah, and yet all along there was this imperative. Well, we can't let it go. We can't let it go. And there's always the story about, well, if John Kennedy had lived, he would have ended the war. Well, maybe. He knew it was a bad deal,
Yeah.
but he wasn't willing to do anything until after he was reelected.
Exactly.
Right.
He was
Yeah.
concerned about the next election too.
Yeah.
And of course, he never
Yes.
got that chance. And Lyndon Johnson was a very insecure man and was unable to actually do what he thought was right. I mean, you listen to those conversations, you hear a man who knows this is not right, but can't change it.
Yeah, and it's sad because, in subsequent years, I've learned more about Johnson. I forget the guy's name who wrote this excellent biography of him, but, he grew up very poor in the South, in Texas, and I think one of his first jobs was teaching at his, I think Latino school or whatever, these poor kids. And the civil rights, his achievements were amazing in civil rights, but he was destroyed because he was trapped by the war. And as I said, the conversation, it was obvious he didn't really want to, but he was trapped because he didn't want to be the one losing the war. That's the thing about our American exceptionalism. We can't be the one losing the war or we won't get reelected. So he trashed our economy and it didn't fulfill the war on poverty he wanted. It's very sad.
And actually, talking about losing a war, there was one of the more deceptive pieces of language because they talked about started in secret, ended in failure. Actually, one of the debates was failure or defeat. We were defeated. We were run out of the country. We always said we won these battles because the Vietnamese, the North, could not hold the ground. They'd melt away. Well, ultimately, we couldn't hold the ground. We melted away.
Exactly.
And anyone who knew Vietnamese history knew that ultimately that would happen. And one of my theories is, that if in 1956 they held elections and Ho Chi Minh had won, there probably would have been some ugliness in Vietnam, some reprisals. You get that when you have a colonial war. But
Probably not 3 million people.
right,
killed.
and then what we did is we just stretched it out another 20 years, like a rubber band. So when they finally let go, it snapped back a lot harder. There were the reprisals, there were the re-educations, there were the refugees. So we just added 20 years to Vietnam's War of Independence. And again, for what reason?
Yeah.
In fact, at some point, somebody said, what does Vietnam mean to America? It doesn't. It's
Doesn't
just,
mean anything.
it's a place.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the other things I wanted to bring up, we talked a little bit about the troops. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on how noble and dedicated our troops were. You see that everywhere, and it's hard not to see that. These are people who went over feeling very patriotic, very strongly, and maybe they still do, but a lot of guys went over and said, why am I here? What is this? And suddenly they had this juxtaposition, America, that we'd grown up with, which is this country that's always right, and here we are wasting people,
Right.
killing them in their homes. How can this be America? And we just don't, that juxtaposition was there. And it seems like as long as the troops are there, all those things are covered. And they also did not do a good job of talking about, we talk about the war overall as a crime, but the massacres.
Right.
A good example of that is three different points in the film they talk about atrocities. There's one scene where they talk about the 101st Battalion's Tiger Force, which was reported by my friend from BFP 75 in Phoenix, Data Stout. They talk about Operation Speedy Express and another one, which was a pacification attempt that killed something like 10,000 so-called Vietnamese communists and got maybe 900 weapons. And then finally, My Lai. So you have these three things going on, separate episodes, and it's not really brought together. This was an ongoing pattern.
truly is a pattern of U.S. history, or U.S. military history in Southeast Asia. I'm one of the people, I don't know how many, probably few people, who talked to both survivors of No Gun Ri, which was a massacre in South Korea, and a survivor of My Lai. I've talked to both of them. And I talked to some South Koreans who were on a committee to investigate massacres. There were 200 similar massacres in Korea during the Korean War. And if you read Nick Terce's book, which is based totally on Pentagon's own reports, there were 400 incidences similar to what happened at My Lai in Vietnam, and none of that. We didn't see any of that discussion.
No.
And I heard some discussion about think about the German Wehrmacht or the SS, and they would go in to Poland and do these massacres and kill people. How many movies have been made about the heroic activity of those soldiers? And this movie is talking about heroic activity of people who did exactly the same thing. They just happened to be Americans. So, you know, a lot of those people did very brave things. They were under stress. A lot of them were there not wanting to be there. But it's hard for me to call them heroes. As it's the same thing when people come up to me and want to thank me for my service. It's hard for me to even be civil in my response about it.
Well, and hear the officials say with a straight face, we have to destroy the village to save it.
Right.
And that was very much the mindset. And then these showing the detail about Kent State, and then the public opinion after 4 kids were killed and 2 more wounded, that 50% of the American people said, oh, they got what was coming to them.
Yeah.
I remember in those days in my church, a man was saying, oh, I guess we're not going to have quite so many protests, are we? After we're killing our own kids. My God.
Like Vietnam kind of was very insidious. It poisoned a lot of our society. And I think one of the things that bothers me most about when I see how the troops are used presented in this movie, it comes back to support the troops now and thank you for your service. Somehow, as long as you say these things, it's okay to send them to these wars. And there's an implication that, well, the thing that was really wrong, the only victims of the Vietnam War were the veterans who weren't thanked, who were supposedly harassed when they came home. No, victims were in Vietnam. Veterans were victims, definitely. Right. We've all suffered from that, but not like the Vietnamese.
In all modern wars, it's the civilian populations who are the victims for the most part. It doesn't pick any modern war since the First World War. It's the civilians who are being killed. The soldiers are being killed too, but the vast majority of deaths are among the civilians.
But yeah, we still have homeless Vietnam veterans. We still have suicides. And the thing is, early in the war, this Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I remember in the airport you'd see some soldiers come in uniform and people stand up and applaud, and we had this concept, as Larry was saying, that they're heroes, but it's I lost a thought. We just have this thing. Oh, that's right. That Vietnam was the first televised war, and the anti-war movement really made a bad mistake, because it was the first time we saw United States soldiers killing people. And I think that was very powerful for the anti-war movement, but we got in our heads, it's the soldiers. And now I don't believe all these stories about people getting spit on. I think that's a fallacy. But it was so much against the soldiers. And like they said in the documentary about calling people baby killers, this, that, and the other. I think that's one thing that Veterans for Peace has come around to. No, it's the policy. It's the decision makers. It's the presidents and Department of Defense, lying to us.
And even there, it wasn't so much universal, the anti-war movement saying they're all baby killers, we want no part of them. In fact, we welcomed them. You know, veterans were definitely an important part of the anti-war movement.
Yeah, I give Burns credit for, in a small area for that, because they essentially said that the real people were the 5 presidents
Yeah.
who were they were the ones that Burns essentially said was responsible for it all, which in itself is not true in a large way. I mean, it's American society where we're exceptional, where violence is a common way to settle things, where, I mean, it's, you know, the United States has been genocidal, you know, against the Native Americans, the slaves. This is American history. This is what America's about. And if Burns would have done this series in such a way that showed that truth, then PBS and David Koch and Bank of America wouldn't have supported
Right.
it, so we would have never seen it.
So we're starting to head toward the end of our hour. So I wanted to ask if, did you think any, like Ken Burns says there's no single truth. Did either of you come up with any single truths? Any
Well-
dominant thought that you got from the movie?
To me, the key is what our organization stands for. That violence and war is not the answer. It's always tempting. As I tell people, it's seductive. It's so, you know, oh, let's go over and kick their butts and let's do this, that, and the other. But as you know, we saw even the Vietnamese people saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't have fought. Maybe we should have talked or whatever. But it's just, we want to get involved in every country. What are we involved, what, 7 wars now or something like that? It's just so tempting.
Larry?
Yeah, I think that it reinforced my ideas that 2 of the biggest problems in American society have to do with our educational system. One is we don't teach history to the kids, so this is all ancient history. It's you know, is a TV program to most of the young people, anybody under 35. And the other is we don't teach critical thinking, so people can't look at something that's presented to them and think about it in such a way to decide whether or not it's true or not. So most of the American public just accepts what they're told without going any deeper. And that's one of the problems with someone like Ken Burns, who's such a good storyteller that the surface story is what most people will see,
Right.
and they won't look at it, you know, beyond it, what's behind it. And so that's a need that we have in this country.
And that's why we and other Veterans for Peace are bringing this out. You know, there's a lot more than just what was presented in those 18 hours. I mean, that's a good panorama of the war, a lot of information, but to really understand it, you need to get behind that. And that's, the movie doesn't really give you that perspective. It says, here it all is. At the very end, the anti-war protesters apologize. Everybody comes together at the wall. What I thought was powerful was David Brinkley standing in Arlington Cemetery saying, maybe future presidents will come here and think about it before they launch another war. That also made me want to scream because they haven't. And I think the other thing is, you know, this is not just ancient history. This is, I mean, this still applies to our foreign policy.
Exactly.
We are doing the same thing now in Iraq, Afghanistan, other parts of the world that we did in Vietnam. The same kind of intervention, the same kind of arrogance, the same kind of lack of understanding of those societies. You know, America can be involved in the world, but it really needs to be part of that world. And because we're the exceptional country, we don't do that.
Since the Second World War, we've spent, I don't know, 15 or 17 trillion dollars on nuclear weapons. Think how many friends the United States would have around the world had that money been spent on roads, clean water, hospitals, at schools. I mean, it would be a totally different world.
Yeah, the Marshall Plan after World War II, we rebuilt Europe just so it wouldn't fall to communism. And we were in debt far more than we are now after World War II. That we should be building hospitals and schools in third world countries, but no one wants to pay any taxes.
Well, as you said, war is not the answer. So we'll take that as our truth from this. I want to thank you both for coming in and taking the time to talk about the movie and full disclosure. I would encourage people to visit the Vietnam Full Disclosure site. That is www.vietnamfulldisclosure.org. You will find a slew of articles about the Ken Burns documentary, about the Vietnam War, and give you some perspective that you're not getting through the mainstream media. And then in closing, I'd like to say the Veterans for Peace Michigan statement prominently calls for educating the public about the cost of war and abolishing war as an instrument of national policy. An important part of that mission is reporting the truth about war and its impact on combatants and civilians alike. Veterans for Peace created the Vietnam Full Disclosure Program in order to provide information that is often ignored or discounted in most debates about the Vietnam. We hope that you use the information you've learned tonight to understand all the lessons of that war. As always, persistence is the key. And I would actually like to leave the last word to Larry, who has a poem. So Larry?
This is a poem that may offend some people, but war is offensive. So it's called The Smell of War. The war was black and white at first, but then in living color, red and yellow and khaki green, brought into the living room. But what was always missing was the smell of war. My war smelled of dying vegetation, ode to Agent Orange, burnt gunpowder and burnt people, dark blood, sweet and warm, piss, shit, sweat, testosterone. The same smell is found in what is left of a pizza shop in Jerusalem. Now the smell of war is in Jenin and Ramallah, piss and shit and blood mixed with frustrated cries of the people. Helen Caldecott holds up a picture of a baby with his head blown off. The smell of his head seeps up through the concrete rubble after the tanks roll on. The same smell of piss and shit and blood rose in the hot desert some days after Iraqi soldiers were buried alive. The same smell at Waco when the embers died and the smoke cleared. The same smell of more piss and shit and blood was found by firefighters and police digging below the Twin Towers space. The same smell, more piss, more shit, more blood, was found near Kabul, raised with the dust by bombs from 40,000 feet. Next, we'll find that same smell in some new axis of evil, where the smell of oil added to the smell of dead children, added to the putrescent odor of piss and shit and blood, of war and death, should gag us all. However, as Erasmus said 500 years ago, war is sweet to those who know it not.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you for watching.
Soldiers speak out. We can tell the truth of what we've seen. We are not liars. Soldiers speak out. We have a duty to all children and to their future.